This is what a housing market crash would look like in Atlanta. One of the first things that we would notice if there was a housing market crash here is that the appraisers and lenders would have a very difficult time having consistency in appraisal values for homes. When you buy a home with a loan, naturally your lender is going to want you to have an appraisal done. And this is to make sure that the amount of money you're offering to purchase the home is what the actual home is worth. So the lender has an appraiser go out to the home to give an appraisal value to make sure that those two things are equal. Right now, even though we're not in a housing market crash, it's very difficult for appraisers to be consistent in their appraisal values. This is really my least favorite part of the home buying process. It's actually something that I am really feel very strongly about. And unfortunately, there isn't really like a standard method for determining the appraisal value of a home. I know that it's commonly thought of as there being like a regular formula that an appraiser uses to figure out what the value of the home is, and like every appraiser uses that same formula, but that is not the case. There is no standard formula, there is no standard method for determining the value of a home, and even today many times appraisers kind of differ on what they believe the appraisal value of a home is. So if we were to be in a housing market crash, this would completely change the game. It would be very difficult for appraisers to figure out how much a home is worth. And if we look back at 2008 and 2009, during that housing market crash, this was really the main issue with the housing market, is we kind of got to a place where people just stopped understanding what the value of a home was. It wasn't like the value of homes went down to zero. It was just we were in a period of like nobody knew what the value of houses were. Right there when the banks crashed and a lot of the mortgage providers went out of business, this is where we kind of came to a point where people didn't know how much their home is worth. So if we have another market crash here in Atlanta, it's definitely going to be something that we see with appraisers, and just how inconsistent appraisers are today is going to be even more emphasized during a housing market crash. And this inconsistency in the appraisal values is going to mean that homeowners will get to a point where we just don't know what the value of our homes are. Like if the appraiser can't figure out how much our home is worth, then the homeowner will certainly not be able to really grasp how much our homes are worth if we were in a market crash. Okay, continuing down this rabbit hole of if the housing market crashes in Atlanta, what else are we going to see? Well, another thing that we would see is that the new construction companies would stop building homes. Right now, as there are many buyers and there is a strong demand for new homes, new construction companies are building homes regularly. There's always new neighborhoods. There's always new construction homes all over Metro Atlanta. But if we were in a market crash, this would mean that there would be far less buyers. And so new construction companies would completely stop, even go out of business, go bankrupt. This is, again, what happened in 2008, 2009, and certainly what we would see again if there was a housing market crash. Another thing that we would see in this imaginary market crash situation here in Atlanta is that everybody would be trying to sell their home. This is like the definition of a market crash, is that there are far more people trying to sell than there are trying to buy. And currently, there are many people trying to buy a home, far more than there are people trying to sell. In fact, if you're thinking about buying a home in Atlanta, you can feel free to call, text, or email me anytime. I really am super thankful for everybody who has reached out asking me about buying a home in Atlanta. I'm more than happy to help with your home buying needs. But if we saw that market crash here in Atlanta, there would be a lot more people trying to sell their homes. So instead of the housing market being an extreme seller's market where there are far more buyers than there are sellers, in a housing market crash situation, we'd see far more sellers than there would be buyers. And so this is something that I remember in Florida, this was something that we used to see a lot of just 10, 20 years ago, there would be people who would regularly just keep their houses on the market at a certain price. And it was like a different kind of housing market. It's not like the way we see it here in Metro Atlanta now. It was more like many people, like everybody in the neighborhood had like a what they called a move me price. So if you were willing to pay that price for the home, then they would be willing to sell it. And they just kept their home on the market indefinitely. And so this is something that we would see in Metro Atlanta if there was a housing market crash. People would keep their home on the market indefinitely for a certain price, just hoping to be able to get out of this asset while home prices and home values are dropping. And then another thing that we would certainly see if there was a housing market crash here in Atlanta is lots more lender incentives or buyer incentives from lenders to take out loans. Because a housing market crash means that there would be far less buyers, this means that the lenders would be desperate for people to take out a loan. Right now in Metro Atlanta, there are not very many programs or incentives for buyers because there's so many people trying to buy, to get a mortgage, to get a loan, that lenders don't really have to do much to get business. If we were in a housing market crash, there would be far less buyers, which means far less borrowers, which means that these lenders would have to do more work to try to get borrowers. So they'd be doing things like down payment assistance or things like waiving PMI. They could be all kinds of different programs for trying to get buyers to take out loans with those companies, waiving closing costs or providing money to be able to contribute to closing costs. Again, these are the kinds of things that we would see from the lenders. Now, I know a lot of people are wondering if we're going to see some kind of market crash in Metro Atlanta or anywhere in the United States, just based on how crazy the housing market has been for quite a while now. And I think one thing that we should ask ourselves is, what might cause this housing market crash? And I think there are a few things that could cause a housing market crash. Certainly, one of the most obvious ones would be unethical practices by lenders. This is what caused the housing market crash in 2008, 2009. So lenders were giving mortgages to people with terrible credit scores or people that had no job, or they were giving out multiple mortgages to the same person, even though they could only afford one mortgage. And all of this led to the housing market crash from 2008. So if we were to see some kind of unethical practice from lenders again, it could lead to a market crash. However, right now, I think for the most part, everybody believes there are not those kinds of unethical practices. Now, back in 2008, those things were hidden. So of course, we wouldn't know if the lenders were doing some kind of unethical thing today. If we all knew about it, we wouldn't be buying houses. So it's hard to say that it certainly would not happen again, but there are so many more restrictions and there are so many more regulations with lenders today because of what happened in 2008. Another thing that could certainly cause a housing market crash would be a recession. You might argue that we're already in a recession. And so if this recession gets worse and people start losing jobs and their ability to pay their mortgage, and we see lots more foreclosures, this could certainly lead to a housing market crash. Right now, we're not really even close to that point because there are far more people who can afford mortgages than there are people willing to sell a home. So right now, the demand is far higher than the supply. So it would take a very long recession. It would take a much worse recession than we're seeing right now to reach a point where there are less buyers than there are homes for sale. And then another idea that I've come up with here that maybe would cause a housing market crash 10, 15 years down the road is if we kind of got to a point where there was a shortage of homes for sale for so long that people got to a point maybe in 10 or 15 years where they were like, okay, I just have to move now. What we're seeing in the housing market right now is kind of, it's like a dam in the river, and like all of these people who want to move are currently not moving because they don't know where they would move to, or they don't know where, what house would they buy if they sold their home today. Many people today don't want to sell because they don't know where they would go, or interest rates are too high. Whatever it may be, there are a lot of people right now who would like to move, but are not selling. If we experience this for a long time, 10 years, I just wonder if we would get to a point where maybe interest rates come down and suddenly everybody starts to sell their home. All this pent up energy, this pent up demand for selling, if we were to reach a point where it just kind of boiled over and everybody started selling, then we would see far more people trying to sell than buy. This could maybe lead to a housing market crash. Or another idea is if like all of these corporations who own real estate, if something happened, like maybe there was some law or some regulation that caused these corporations to no longer be able to own real estate, and so all of a sudden they started selling off in mass the real estate that they owned, again, this could cause maybe a housing market crash. So just theorizing there, some things that maybe could cause a housing market crash one day down the road. And then another really good question is how would all of this affect the Metro Atlanta area? I think right now in Metro Atlanta, we're seeing lots of growth, lots of people coming here to find jobs and to find lower cost of living. But if there was a housing market crash, my theory is that we would see the very opposite. We'd see lots of people leaving the Metro Atlanta area. And so it would be a very extreme difference if we had a market crash here. Instead of people coming here to find jobs, if we were in a recession where businesses were going bankrupt, then maybe there would be a lot less jobs here. So there would be a lot less people moving here, people moving away from Georgia to find, higher paying jobs. And then something else that I think is important to think about, like I've said many times on these videos before, Georgia just is a state that has less regulation in general. There's less legislation, there's less laws, there's less regulation on businesses here in Georgia and in Metro Atlanta. And so I would assume that if we had a recession or a market crash, people would be expecting their government, their city or their state governments to be stepping up and doing something about these problems. And here in Georgia, the state and the cities don't really step up to do as much as you would experience maybe in other parts of the US. So again, if there was a housing market crash and people were expecting the government to kind of bail them out, they would most likely be leaving Georgia to find that. It's not really something that you would find here in Georgia as much as other states. Of course, the city and the state would help out somewhat. Georgia always has, but I'm just saying that it's not as common here in Georgia as other states. And then another thing that we'd see here in Metro Atlanta, if there was a housing market crash, is that there would be much more impact on the farther out suburbs than in the city of Atlanta. This is what happened in 2008 during the housing market crash. It was the suburbs that were very far out from Metro Atlanta that kind of had a bigger impact. The economies tended to worse there. There were lower household incomes in the farther out suburbs. And that's because the businesses and the companies that are doing the hiring all tend to be closer to the core of the city of Atlanta. And so those farther out suburbs won't fare as well during a housing market crash or during a recession. So certainly a whole lot to think about if there was a housing market crash here in Metro Atlanta. For now, the cost of living here in Atlanta is far lower than some of the other major metropolitan cities of the US. If you want a breakdown of how much you should expect for monthly expenses here in Metro Atlanta, check out this video. I'll see you there.